Constantinople in the year 1400 stands as a city caught between memory and extinction. Within walls that once sheltered 500,000 souls, fewer than 70,000 now move through streets that have become pathways between orchards and ruins. The mighty capital of an empire that once stretched from Spain to Persia has shrunk to this, a collection of villages huddled within fortifications, built for a metropolis 10 times its size. Ottoman Turkish forces have blockaded the city for 6 years now, and food grows scarcer with each passing month. Emperor Manuel II Palaeologus faces an impossible choice. He can remain in his dying capital and watch his people slowly starve, or he can do something no Roman emperor has done in 1,000 years: leave his realm entirely and beg the kings of Western Europe for help. This is the story of a civilization that refused to accept its own death, of ordinary people who chose survival over surrender, and of the stubborn, desperate hope that kept Constantinople breathing when every rational calculation said it should have stopped. To understand what the people of Constantinople were fighting to preserve, we must first understand what they had already lost. In the centuries before the crisis, Constantinople had been the greatest city in the Christian world. Travelers approaching by sea would see the famous triple walls rising above the horizon, their towers and battlements stretching for miles along the coastline. The dome of the great cathedral of Hagia Sophia, the largest church in Christendom, caught the morning light and seemed to float above the rooftops. Inside those walls, forums and colonnaded streets bustled with merchants from every corner of the known world. The Mazy, the main avenue, ran through the heart of the city past monuments and churches, past workshops where craftsmen produced silk textiles and gold jewelry, past markets where spices from India and furs from Russia changed hands. The empire these people served had once defined civilization itself. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century, Constantinople carried on. The emperors here called themselves Romans, spoke Greek, worshipped Christ, and maintained traditions stretching back more than 1,000 years. They had survived Arab sieges, Bulgarian invasions, and Russian attacks. Their walls had never fallen to an enemy force. Then came the catastrophe that Constantinople never truly recovered from. In 1204, armies of the Fourth Crusade, supposedly bound for the Holy Land, turned instead upon the Christian city they were meant to protect. For 3 days, the Crusaders pillaged and murdered, carrying off treasures that had accumulated over 8 centuries, stripping churches of their gold, and committing acts of violence that shocked even their contemporaries. The great bronze horses that had stood in the hippodrome since antiquity were shipped to Venice. Relics of saints were scattered across Western Europe. The Latin Crusaders established their own empire in Constantinople, a foreign occupation that would last until 1261, when the Greeks finally reclaimed their capital. But the city they returned to was a shadow. The population had plummeted. Entire neighborhoods lay abandoned. The grand palaces stood empty, their lead roofing stripped and melted down 4 coins. Churches that had dazzled visitors with their golden mosaics now showed water damage and crumbling stonework. Recovery from such devastation might have been possible if peace had followed. Instead came the Black Death. The plague arrived in Constantinople in 1347, carried by ships from the Crimean port of Kaffa. Contemporary accounts describe the horror with unflinching detail. Emperor John Sexto Cantacusenos, who was ruling at the time, watched his own 13-year-old son die within days of the first symptoms. The historian Nikephoros Gregoras recorded that the disease attacked all ages and social conditions without distinction, leaving no family untouched. Bodies accumulated faster than they could be buried. Some estimates suggest that as many as 2/3 of the city's remaining population perished. Unlike Western Europe, where the plague eventually receded and allowed populations to rebuild, Constantinople experienced repeated outbreaks throughout the following decades. The disease returned in 1361, 1386 and 1391, each time claiming more lives from a population that could scarcely afford to lose them. By 1400, the physical transformation of the city had become unmistakable. Spanish ambassador González de Clavijo, who passed through Constantinople in 1403 while traveling to the court of Tamerlane, described what he saw: a city of small neighborhoods separated by orchards and cultivated fields, the ruins of palaces and churches visible everywhere. The great forums that had once hosted imperial processions now grew vegetables. Inside the walls designed to protect hundreds of thousands, gardens had replaced entire districts. The people who remained adapted to their reduced circumstances. Life concentrated along the shores of the Golden Horn and the Sea of Marmara, where fishing boats still brought in catches, and where the trade that sustained the city continued on a diminished scale. The wealthy lived in houses that combined faded elegance with practical necessity. The poor crowded into multi-storied wooden dwellings in the denser quarters near the harbors. Yet even in decline, certain things endured. Hagia Sophia still held services, its golden mosaics gleaming in the light from windows that had illuminated Byzantine worship for nearly 9 centuries. The patriarch still led processions through streets where the faithful gathered to venerate icons and pray for deliverance. The rhythms of the Orthodox liturgy marked the passage of seasons, just as they had for generations beyond counting. For these people, Constantinople was not merely a city. It was the New Jerusalem, the center of the true Christian faith, the seat of an empire that traced its authority back to the Rome of the Caesars. To abandon it was unthinkable. The pressure that would define their generation came from the east. The Ottoman Turks had been expanding steadily throughout the 14th century, conquering territory that the Byzantines could no longer defend. By 1394, Sultan Bayezid, a commander so feared that his enemies called him Yildirim, the Thunderbolt, had surrounded Constantinople on all sides. His armies controlled the countryside beyond the walls. His ships patrolled the straits. The blockade that began that year was designed not to take the city by assault, but to starve it into submission. Food prices rose sharply as supplies dwindled. Merchants who once brought grain from the Black Sea region found their ships turned back or seized. The city's gardens, which had seemed like symbols of decline, now became vital sources of sustenance. Families who had the space cultivated every available patch of earth. Those without land depended on whatever the monasteries and charitable institutions could provide. The winter of 1396 brought news that briefly kindled hope. A great crusading army, led by the King of Hungary and composed of knights from across Western Europe, was marching to relieve Constantinople. For weeks, the city's defenders watched the horizon, waiting for the banners of their rescuers to appear. The news that finally arrived was devastating. At Nicopolis, on the Danube, the Crusaders had been utterly destroyed by Basidi's forces. The flower of Western European chivalry lay dead or in Ottoman dungeons. No help would come from that direction. Inside the blockaded city, Emperor Manuel II faced the consequences of this disaster. He was a scholar by temperament, a man who wrote theological treatises and composed poetry. But circumstances had forced him to become something else entirely. His court had shrunk to a handful of loyal servants. His treasury was nearly empty. The soldiers manning the walls served without regular pay, motivated by faith and the knowledge that surrender meant either death or slavery. Manuel understood that his city could not hold out indefinitely. The trickle of supplies that still reached Constantinople through Venetian and Genoese merchants was not enough to sustain the population through a prolonged siege. Something had to change, or everything his ancestors had built over 11 centuries would end within his lifetime. The plan that emerged was unprecedented and desperate. Manuel would leave Constantinople himself and travel to the courts of Western Europe. He would make his case in person to the kings of France and England, would appeal to their Christian conscience and their fear of Turkish expansion. No Byzantine emperor had attempted such a journey since ancient times. The risks were enormous. His nephew, John VII, with whom he had fought a civil war, might seize the throne in his absence. The Turks might launch a final assault. Yet remaining in Constantinople offered only the certainty of slow defeat. On December 10, 1399, Manuel slipped out of the blockaded city aboard a Venetian galley. He had entrusted Constantinople's defense to his nephew, now reconciled and serving as regent, along with a small garrison of French soldiers who had arrived earlier that year under the command of Marshal Bouchicot. As the ship carried him westward across the Mediterranean, Manuel watched the towers of his capital fade into the distance, wondering if he would ever see them again. The journey that followed took him first to Venice, where the Doge received him with honors appropriate to his rank. Tentomilan verdu Gian Galazo Visconti promised support. 10 to Paris, where King Charles VI welcomed him at the royal palace, and the scholars of the Sorbonne engaged him in theological discussions. Manuel found himself a curiosity in Western courts. This emperor from a fabled city that most Europeans knew only from legends. He attended masses alongside Catholic nobles. Though the Eastern and Western churches had been in schism for 3 centuries, he distributed relics from Constantinople's vast collection, fragments of the true cross and other sacred objects, hoping these gifts would move Western hearts to action. In December 1400, he crossed the English Channel to meet King Henry IV. becoming the first Roman emperor to set foot in Britain in over 1,000 years. Henry received him at Blackheath and hosted him for Christmas at Eltham Palace, where jousts were held in his honor. Throughout his travels, Manuel proved an effective advocate. Contemporary accounts describe him as dignified and learned, a monarch whose bearing commanded respect even in his reduced circumstances. Adam of Usk, an English lawyer who observed his visit, wrote with both admiration and sorrow about this great Christian prince, driven from the furthest east to the furthest western islands, to seek aid against the Yet despite the warm welcomes and generous promises, the practical results were mixed. The kings of Europe faced their own troubles. France was torn by the madness of Charles VI and the rivalries of his nobles. England was consumed by the aftermath of Richard II's deposition. The Pope in Rome and the rival Pope in Avignon competed for loyalty, dividing Christendom's attention. Everyone expressed sympathy. No one sent armies. Manuel received gifts of money, enough to maintain his dignity abroad, but nothing that would lift the siege of his capital. He lingered in Paris through 1401 and into 1402, writing letters to his friend Manuel Crisolaras that revealed growing despair beneath their philosophical reflections. Meanwhile, in Constantinople, life under siege continued with a grim routine. The defenders on the walls watched Turkish camps spread across the landscape beyond the moat. Ottoman forces made periodic attempts to test the defenses, probing for weaknesses, but the famous triple walls held. The soldiers who manned these fortifications came from every remaining corner of Byzantine society. There were professional soldiers descended from military families that had served the empire for generations. There were Italian merchants from the Genoese and Venetian trading colonies, men who had commercial reasons to resist Ottoman conquest. There were monks who had set aside their contemplative lives to defend the faith with weapons. And there were ordinary citizens, bakers and fishermen and craftsmen, who took their turns at watch, because there simply were not enough trained warriors to go around. These defenders developed the skills needed for siege warfare through necessity. They learned to spot the signs of an impending assault, to identify the movements of troops massing for attack. They maintained the walls, repairing damage from the occasional bombardment with whatever materials they could find. They kept watch through long nights, knowing that vigilance might be the only thing standing between their families and disaster. Morale fluctuated with the news that filtered through the blockade. Reports of Manuel's reception in foreign courts brought hope. The continuing absence of any relief army brought despair. Then, in the summer of 1402, news arrived that changed everything. Far to the east, a storm had gathered that even the mighty Ottomans could not withstand. Timur, the great Mongol warlord who had already devastated Persia and northern India, had turned his attention to Anatolia. His armies numbered perhaps 140,000 warriors, veterans of campaigns across half of Asia, equipped with war elephants and siege weapons, and driven by the ambition of a conqueror who dreamed of rebuilding the empire of Khan. Sultan Bayezid had no choice but to abandon his siege of Constantinople and march his forces to meet this threat. On July 28, 1402, the two armies clashed near Ankara, in one of the decisive battles of medieval history. Have you ever heard of a city so legendary, so desired, that it survived for over 1,000 years against all odds? That city was Constantinople, the heart of the Byzantine Empire, a jewel coveted by empires from east and west. For centuries, its massive walls stood as a symbol of impenetrable strength, the last bastion of a Roman legacy in a changing world. But by the 15th century, this once mighty empire was just a shadow of its former self, a small city-state clinging to survival. The rising Ottoman Empire, a formidable new power, saw Constantinople not just as a prize, but as the key to their own destiny. The stage was set for one of history's most epic showdowns. In 1402, the end seemed near. The Ottoman Sultan, Bayezid I, known as the Thunderbolt, had the city completely surrounded. His massive army was poised for the final assault. Inside the walls, Emperor Manuel II, Palaiologos and his people were preparing for the inevitable. Supplies were dwindling, morale was low, and hope was all but lost. They had sent desperate pleas for help to the Christian kingdoms of Europe, but help was slow to come, if it came at all. It looked like the final chapter of the Roman Empire was about to be written. The city that had stood for a millennium was on the brink of collapse. But then, something completely unexpected happened. A twist of fate so dramatic it sounds like something from a fantasy novel. From the Far East, a new storm was brewing, a force even more terrifying than the Ottomans. This was the army of Timur, also known as Tamerlane, a ruthless and brilliant conqueror who'd forged a vast empire across Central Asia. Timur saw the rising power of the Ottomans as a direct challenge to his own dominance. He sent a message to Bayezid, demanding he lift the siege of Constantinople. Bayezid, proud and confident, refused. He had no idea who he was dealing with. The clash of these two titans was inevitable. In the Battle of Ankara, in 1402, Timur's forces, with their terrifying war elephants and disciplined cavalry, absolutely crushed the Ottoman army. Sultan Bayezid himself was captured, a humiliation from which the Ottoman Empire would take years to recover. Legend says he was kept in a cage and paraded as a trophy. For Constantinople, this was a miracle. The immediate threat was gone. The siege was lifted. The city had been granted a reprieve, a second chance, all thanks to an invading conqueror from the other side of the world. The Byzantines had been saved, but it was only a temporary delay of the inevitable. The half-century of breathing room that Timur's invasion provided was a strange time for Constantinople. The Ottoman Empire was thrown into a civil war, a period known as the Ottoman Interregnum, as Bayezid's sons fought each other for the throne. This chaos gave the Byzantines a chance to play diplomat, supporting one claimant against another, trying to keep their old enemy divided and weak. For a little while, it seemed to work. The city even managed to reclaim some of its lost territories, but it was like patching a sinking ship with tape. The fundamental problems remained. The empire was bankrupt, its population had dwindled, and its military was a ghost of its former glory. The pleas for help to Western Europe continued, but they came with a heavy price. The Pope demanded that the Eastern Orthodox Church submit to his authority, a condition that was deeply unpopular with the Byzantine people and clergy. The saying better the Sultan's turban than the Pope's tiara became common on the streets of Constantinople. This division between East and West, a schism that had lasted for centuries, would prove fatal. While the Byzantine emperors desperately sought a united Christian front, their own people were torn, and the great powers of Europe were too busy with their own conflicts to mount a major crusade. As the years passed, the Ottoman Empire slowly but surely pieced itself back together. A new line of capable sultans emerged, and by the 1440s, they were once again casting their eyes towards the city that sat right in the middle of their expanding domain. The final reprieve was coming to an end. The clock that had been paused was starting to tick again. And this time there would be no Timur to save them. The final act of this 1,000-year-old drama was about to begin, and it would feature a new, ambitious young sultan with a singular obsession. In 1451, a 21-year-old ascended to the Ottoman throne. His name was Mehmed II. From a young age, Mehmed was fixated on one goal, the conquest of Constantinople. He was intelligent, ruthless, and filled with a sense of destiny. He believed, as his predecessors did, that the city was his by right. Unlike them, he possessed the will, the resources, and the modern technology to make it happen. He wasn't going to let this prize slip through his fingers. He immediately began preparations for the ultimate siege, a campaign that would change the course of world history. Mehmed's preparations were meticulous and terrifyingly modern. His masterstroke was the construction of a massive fortress on the European side of the Bosphorus, straight, right under the nose of the Byzantines. This fortress, called Rumeli Hisari, or the Throat Cutter, allowed him to control all sea traffic to the city, cutting off any potential aid from the Black Sea. It was built in just a few months, a clear signal of his terrifying efficiency and determination. Then, he commissioned something the world had never seen before. Giant cannons. He hired a Hungarian engineer named Orban, who had first offered his services to the Byzantines, but they couldn't afford his price. Orban built him a series of monstrous bronze cannons, including the Great Turkish Bombard, a cannon so large it could fire a 1,200-pound stone ball over a mile. These were the superweapons of their day, designed for one purpose: to shatter the unbreakable walls of Constantinople. Inside the city, the mood was grim. The last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI Palaiologos, was a brave and noble leader, but he faced an impossible task. He had only about 7,000 soldiers to defend 14 miles of walls against an Ottoman army estimated to be at least 10 times that size, maybe more. His forces were a mix of his own professional troops, citizen militia, and a few hundred determined Genoese and Venetian mercenaries, led by the heroic Giovanni Giusto. They knew the odds were stacked against them, but they were determined to fight to the last man for their emperor, their faith, and their city. On April 6, 1453, the siege began. The thunder of Mem's great cannons echoed across the plains. Day after day, they relentlessly pounded the ancient Theodosian walls. The defenders worked tirelessly, frantically repairing the damage under a constant barrage of cannonballs, arrows, and musket fire. For weeks, they held on. They were masters of defense, and their courage was incredible. They even managed a small naval victory when 4 Genoese ships fought their way through the entire Ottoman fleet to bring much-needed supplies into the city's harbor, the Golden Horn. This small victory raised morale, but it couldn't change the final outcome. Mehmed was a brilliant and creative strategist. When his navy couldn't break the massive chain that protected the Golden Horn, he did the unthinkable. He ordered his men to build a greased log road over the hill of Galata, and physically dragged his warships overland, bypassing the chain and dropping them directly into the city's harbor. The defenders woke up one morning to find the Ottoman fleet now inside their protected waters, attacking their weakest seawalls. The psychological blow was devastating. The noose was tightening. After almost 2 months of constant bombardment and assaults, the city was at its breaking point. The walls were crumbling, and the defenders were exhausted, wounded, and vastly outnumbered. On the night of May 28th, strange and ominous lights were seen over the city, which many interpreted as a sign that God had finally abandoned them. Emperor Constantine XI gave a final, moving speech to his commanders, urging them to fight bravely for their city and their faith. They then went to the Hagia Sophia, the great cathedral, for one last Christian service, Orthodox and Catholic, side by side in their final hours. In the pre-dawn darkness of May 29, 1453, Mehmed launched his final, all-out assault. He sent his troops in waves. First came the irregulars, the Bashibazauks, meant to tire and wear down the defenders. Then came his regular Anatolian troops. Finally, as the sun began to rise, he unleashed his elite, In the heat of the battle, the Genoese commander Giustiniani was badly wounded, and his withdrawal from the walls caused a panic among the defenders. At that critical moment, the Ottomans discovered a small, unlocked gate. The Janissaries poured through, swarming the walls from within. It was over. Emperor Constantine XI was last seen casting off his royal insignia and charging into the fray, fighting and dying alongside his soldiers. A fitting end for the last of the Roman emperors. The fall of Constantinople was a pivotal moment in history. It marked the definitive end of the Roman Empire, a legacy that had stretched for nearly 1,500 years. The city, renamed Istanbul, became the magnificent new capital of the Ottoman Empire, a center of power for centuries to come. The event sent shockwaves across Europe, accelerating the Renaissance as Byzantine scholars fled west, bringing with them the priceless knowledge of ancient Greece and Rome. It also spurred on the Age of Discovery, as European powers, cut off from the old land routes to the east, sought new sea routes to Asia. The story of Constantinople's fall is more than just a battle. It's a tale of incredible resilience, a surprising twist of fate, and the dawn of a new era in world history. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this journey into the past, please hit that like button and subscribe for more epic history stories. We'll see you in the next one. Timur's victory at Ankara was their salvation, a fact that bred a complex gratitude, thankful for the breath, shamed by its source. For 8 years, they had endured the slow, grinding pressure of a siege designed to choke them into oblivion. Now, with the Ottoman princes tearing each other apart in a civil war for the shattered sultanate, the pressure was gone. The silence was the first new sound. To Constance, low-grade anxiety that had thrummed through the city for a decade, the watchfulness on the walls, the calculation behind every bite of bread, The nightly fear that the morning might bring the final assault began, hesitantly, to recede. It left a strange hollow in its place. Manuel II's return in June was a subdued triumph. He entered not as a conquering hero, but as a weary diplomat who had secured a stay of execution. The treaty he brought back from the Ottoman Prince Suleiman was generous, reclaiming key coastal towns in the great city of Thessaly. But everyone, from the emperor down to the fishermen mending their nets along the Golden Horn, understood the truth. These were not lands won by valor, but gifts from a weakened adversary buying Byzantine neutrality in a fratricidal war. Their survival was a geopolitical accident. This knowledge cast a peculiar shadow over the rebuilding. There was energy, yes, but it was the careful, deliberate energy of someone recovering from a long illness, keenly aware of their own fragility. The city set about the work of living again. The first and most visceral change was the return of color and smell to the markets. Ships from the Genoese colonies of Pera and Chios, from Venetian Crete, from the Black Sea ports, now docked freely. The quay, which had been nearly deserted, bustled. Baskets of figs from the Aegean islands, sacks of wheat from Thrace, casks of wine from Macedonia, and olives from the Peloponnese flooded the city. The smell of baking bread, once a faint, torturous memory for many, now wafted strongly from communal ovens. Prices, which had been astronomical, stabilized. For families who had survived on garden vegetables and thin fish stew, the sudden availability of meat, oil, and grain was a physical and psychological tonic. People began to fill out again. The hollowed cheeks and listless eyes of the blockade years were slowly replaced by healthier complexions, but the relationship with food was forever altered. A generation would hoard crusts. A dropped bean would be picked up, not out of poverty, but from a deep-seated, cellular memory of scarcity. The physical reconstruction was pragmatic, not ambitious. There was no grand program to restore the city to its ancient glory. The empire lacked the money, the manpower, and, frankly, the delusion. Instead, the work focused on consolidation and defense. Manuel, with the tactical mind of a man who had stared into the abyss, directed resources to the Theodosian walls. Sections that had been patched with rubble and timber during the desperate years were now properly repaired with stone and mortar. The great moat was cleared of debris. Towers were reinforced. The message was clear. The reprieve was temporary. The Ottomans would return. The city's defenses must be ready. Within the walls, restoration was selective. Major churches Achaia, Sophia, the Church of the Holy Apostles, the Kora Monastery received attention. Their mosaics, dulled by smoke and neglect, were cleaned. Leaking roofs were fixed. This was spiritual maintenance, attending to the city's soul. But vast swathes of the interior remained as they had become. Pastoral. Sheep and goats grazed in the old Forum of Constantine. Vineyards climbed the slopes of the fourth hill. The great hippodrome, where chariots had once thundered before 100,000 spectators, was now a quiet space where children played and laundry was hung. The city had made peace with its own shrinkage. It was no longer a metropolis. It was a well-fortified town, a citadel for an idea. The true revival was not in stone, but in spirit and parchment. With the immediate threat lifted, the intellectual energy that had been forced into hibernation began to stir. Constantinople was still the greatest repository of classical Greek knowledge in the world. Its libraries, though diminished, held manuscripts of Plato, Aristotle, Homer, and the tragedians that were unknown or lost in the West. During the siege, survival had been the only text. Now, scholars like Manuel II, who had corresponded with the emperor during his European travels, began to teach and copy with renewed urgency. A sense of impending, final twilight gave their work a desperate importance. They weren't just studying the past, they were packing a cultural lifeboat. Chrysalis himself would soon travel to Italy, taking his knowledge of Greek to Florence, where he would teach the humanists and help ignite the Italian Renaissance. The exodus of minds had begun, a slow, deliberate bleed of brilliance from a dying body to a rising one. In the city's monasteries, scribes bent over vellum by candlelight, not just preserving liturgy, but copying philosophical treatises and scientific texts, ensuring that, if the city fell, its mind might not die with it. For the ordinary citizens, the bakers, sailors, silk weavers, and shopkeepers, though, 2 decades after 1403 were a gift, a bonus season of life. Marriages that had been postponed were celebrated. Children were born who knew only peace. The rhythm of the ecclesiastical year, the great festivals of Easter and Christmas. The processions through the streets with beloved icons regained their full sensory splendor. The scent of incense in Hagia Sophia was no longer undercut by the smell of fear. Yet, the trauma was not forgotten. It was metabolized. It became part of the city's story, told by grandparents to wide-eyed children. In the Great Blockade, the stories began. We ate soup made from glue. The experience became folklore, a dark badge of honor that bound the community together. It also bred a hardened, pragmatic resilience. They had seen the worst. They knew what they could endure. This knowledge stripped away certain illusions, leaving a people who were both more pious, clinging to their faith as the one unshakable rock, and more cynical about the promises of princes, both foreign and their own. The pressure, however, had only changed form. It was no longer the acute, choking pressure of a siege, but the chronic, grinding pressure of a terminal diagnosis. Manuel II, the scholar emperor, felt this most acutely. The stroke that partially paralyzed him in his later years was as much a metaphor as a medical condition. He was a ruler trapped in a failing body, steering a failing state. His diplomacy became a masterpiece of delay. He played the Ottoman princes against each other. He renewed appeals to the West, sending his son John VIII to the Council of Constance, and later to the Council of Florence, in a desperate attempt to secure military aid through church union. He fortified the Despotate of Morea and the Peloponnese, creating a potential Byzantine redemption. Every action was a calculation aimed at buying one more year, one more decade, for his civilization. He took monastic vows before his death in 1425, trading the purple robes of empire for the simple black of a monk. It was a fitting end. The emperor, who had spent his life preserving a spiritual and cultural entity, finally joining its most contemplative order, entrusting the doomed political shell to his sons. When the end finally came in 1453, it was witnessed by men and women who were the children of the Great Blockade. They were the generation born in the shadow of Ankura, raised in the long twilight of the reprieve. They'd eaten the bread of peace, but they had been weaned on the stories of starvation. They manned the walls that their parents had repaired. They faced the monstrous cannons of Mehmed II with the same stubborn faith that had once faced Bayezid's starvation strategy. The final, brutal 53-day siege was a more violent version of the pressure their parents had survived. When the walls were breached and the city fell on that terrible May morning, the psychological collapse was, in some ways, less absolute. They had been preparing for this moment all their lives. They had rehearsed the end in family lore. The true legacy of Constantinople in 1400, therefore, is not found in the dramatic fall of 1453. It is found in the 50-year gap between those dates. It is the story of what a society does when granted an unexpected extension. They did not achieve miraculous revival. They achieved something perhaps more human. A dignified, purposeful management of decline. They fortified, they preserved, they taught, and they endured. They raised a final generation in the light of their ancient faith and culture. And when the final pressure came, they had already ensured that the seeds of their civilization in the minds of scholars like Chrysoloras, in the manuscripts shipped to Italy, in the indomitable faith of the Orthodox Church, would be blown far from the crumbling walls to take root in foreign soil and shape the world to come. Their struggle was not to avoid the end, but to shape its meaning. In that, against impossible odds, they succeeded. The civilization, in a transformed way, lived.